All right, here's some background for Genesis chapter 2, verses 4 to 25, what we'll be looking at in Bible study this week. Some commentators suggest that there are two creation accounts, but this does not fit with the overall layout of the book of Genesis, which introduces main themes with genealogies. This is seen 10 times in Genesis, notably Genesis 11:27 to 32, where the count of Terah introduces the story of Abram in Genesis 12. So Genesis 1 and 2 introduce the whole book, the Pentateuch and Bible. The rest of the chapter 1 up to chapter 2, verse 4 are the creation, and 2, 4, and following is the specific story in detail, or more accurately, the story of man. So in Genesis chapter 2, verses 4 to 7, we see that, that this is therefore an account, while told from a different perspective, echoes the previous chapter, as well as foreshadowing the next and following chapters that describe the fall and its effects. So the land is first described without vegetation, echoing back to the unfilled state in Genesis chapter 1. While on the other hand, the description of the vegetation springing up foreshadows the curse in which the weeds will spring up. Likewise, the reference to God not yet having sent rain has a double meaning, where rain is both an eventual good and a future judgment when God will send rain in the form of a flood. Finally, and most central, we are told that there was no man to work the ground, pointing back to creation, not being very good until after the creation of humanity, but also pointing ahead to the curse when man will be forced to work the ground. In the last part of this first section, man is seen as being made from the dust of the earth. This is in contrast to the previous chapter, where the emphasis is placed on human beings being made in God's image. This paradox is softened by the fact that God is said to have breathed into man the breath of life, but the paradox remains and is intentional. Human beings are both from the dust of the earth and therefore humble in origin, but also divine image bearers. This is why in this chapter the creation of man is prior to reference to the other animals, because he has dominion over the created order. The same truth is expressed in the last chapter, when human beings are the last made as pinnacle of creation. The next section we're going to look at is Genesis 2, 8 to 14. And in this section, the author emphasizes the garden in Eden, not the Garden of Eden, but the garden in Eden, the place in which God puts man. Put here has the meaning of keeping safe, as in I put my wallet in a safe, as well as the sense of being dedicated, like articles being put in the tabernacle. There is meaning in both nuances here. The garden is going to be both a place of safety and holiness, as God will dwell with them there. The description of Eden also emphasizes the beauty of the place, with an abundance of gold and jewels, and overall, the picture is one of beauty and meant to reflect the name, as Eden means delight. The trees that God made in the garden, again, echo good vegetation made on the third day, but among the trees, two are singled out: the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. These are foreshadowing what is to come. The rivers mentioned give the location of Eden as roughly in the same location as the future promised land, although only two of the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, are identifiable. Eden foreshadows the good land that God will lead his people into. Or at least, maybe another way of putting it is the promised land echoes back to that original good garden. It also represents or is reflected in the tabernacle and temple, and ultimately in the new heaven and earth, where the tree of life will once again grow, and most importantly, God will dwell with his people. So in the last section of chapter 2, verses 15 to 25, we see that God puts man in the garden to work and take care of the garden. But this phrase could also, if attached to God rather than the garden, mean worship and obey, in which case man's original purpose was stated as such, in opposition to work, which would be later given as a judgment. It could also be that maybe the author intended both um, in parallel, obligation to creator and to creation. This would fit well in with the very next part of the account, in which God for the first time commands the man not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God said that it was not good for man to be alone, and this again looks back to the previous chapter of the goodness of creation. The next part heightens man's aloneness as God brings the animals to him and man names them. Again, echoes from the last chapter, where God created these animals and birds. Now, man names them. This reveals his rule over the animals and also parallels the genealogies that will follow when the descendants are named. But none of the animals were suitable helpers for him, so God made the woman out of the man. This reveals that man is not complete in himself. The way in which woman was suitable may have many meanings, but fundamentally it was one in order to fulfill the purpose of creating a community, not just offspring, but families, societies, and even nations. This is also connected with the institution of marriage, and given as the reason why a man would leave his own father and mother and form a new family with his wife. The picture is that there is a completing of ourselves in marriage. A person does not need to be married to be complete, but they do need community. And this is what is being emphasized here. The final sentence in the chapter summarizes man and woman's place in the garden in their idyllic state, where they are naked but feel no shame. It is also, one last time, foreshadowing what is to come. So that's just an overview of Genesis chapter 2.